Hello friends, my name's Ty and I'm going to read to you. Happy New Year, and for the first story of the new year, we're going to have a selection tonight called The Human Condition. Here we go. The shadows on the rafters above the stage had grown steadily darker in the last few months, and it made the hair on the back of Johnny Rackett's neck tingle. He knew it could only be his imagination, a figment created by his overtired, liquor-soaked brain, and he did his best to ignore it as he sipped from the silver flask in his hand. But every time he glanced up, it looked like the shadows were moving. No, that wasn't quite right. It looked like they had just stopped moving, as though they knew he was about to peak and stilled a moment before. He heard a scuff on the catwalk behind him and held out the flask wordlessly. It was plucked from his hand and he heard the whistling gurgle as Dwayne took a long pull. Johnny had come to enjoy this pre-show ritual he had with his producer, depended on it to calm his nerves before every episode. "What are we doing today again?" Dwayne asked as he returned the flask. "Lesbian strippers stole my baby mama," Johnny said, and took another sip. Dwayne snorted. "Is it just me, or are these guests getting stupider?" "The whole world is getting stupider," Johnny said, then glanced up into the rafters again. Darker, too. He looked down into the studio where the audience was shuffling through the doors at the back to find their seats. Another sold-out crowd, just like every other show for the past 3 years. "You know, I was only supposed to do this once?" Johnny asked. "Really?" "Yeah, just one show, to publicize the last road tour. The ratings were so high the network threw buckets of money at me just to get me to do another one. Before I knew it, I was locked into a full-time thing, and hating every minute of it." "The money's good, though," Dwayne said. "The money is phenomenal, but it's dishonest. We're throwing some poor assholes up on the stage and pointing out their problems, making a joke of how fucked up their lives are so the audience can feel better about themselves for 25 minutes. He took another sip and had to resist the urge to spit a mouthful of good scotch into the audience below. "I miss the days on the road, broke as fuck, but happy because everywhere I went I was giving people a laugh, pointing out how stupid the world is and making the audience feel like they were in on the joke. It was an honest laugh." He lifted the flask to his lips but held it there without drinking. "It was a good laugh. It's not too late to go back." "You're right," Johnny said as he regarded the crowd. "I could turn my back on this shit, flip the bird to the network, and the money, and the bullshit. Hit the road with nothing but a notebook filled with bad ideas. Start making people laugh again." "It's something to consider," Dwayne said, and glanced down at his watch. "But while you're considering it, get your ass downstairs so we're not late again." Johnny nodded and screwed the cap back on the flask. He turned to follow Dwayne down the stairs and paused to look up into the rafters. He still had that weird sensation the shadows were moving. Like 3 years of people's misery, squeezed out of them for the entertainment of the crowd, was coming to a slow boil. Smoothing down the hairs on the back of his neck with one shaking hand, he turned back towards the stairs and clumped his way to stage level. The guests were lined up behind the wall of the set, glaring hatefully at one another. 2 men, one with a heavy gut hanging over his belt, the other skinny and bent as a microphone stand with a wisp of beard wavering off his narrow chin, stood back to back, arms crossed, pouting looks on their faces. Their ex-partners, 2 skinny girls who looked like the mold for the stereotype of trailer trash, stood opposite them. A glowering security guard in a black t-shirt so tight it looked like a coat of paint on his dark skin, stood between them to prevent any silliness. The alleged lesbian strippers were in a dressing room somewhere to prevent any pre-show hysterics that could not be enjoyed by the audience. Johnny popped a breath mint into his mouth to cover the aftertaste of good scotch and clapped his hands together while he favored them all with his best stage smile. "Everyone ready?" They transferred their glares from each other and slapped them on Johnny, his grin doing nothing to dull their edges. Quite often the people they brought in were halfway acting, laying on the hatred a little thick so they could score a free ride out of whatever shithole town they lived in, but with this crew, the hatred was very real. Johnny worked the breath mint across the roof of his mouth as he resisted an urge to sigh. "Okay, Bobby?" The fat man lifted his eyebrows. "You'll come out first and tell us your story. Then I'll bring out Honey." One of the skinny girls showed him a grin that was missing the left incisor, and gave me her a vaguely maniacal look. "Then Daniel will come out." Johnny pointed to the skinny kid and his sparse beard, followed by Susan. the other skinny girl, her face pocked with acne so bad it looked as though a very small, intense trench war had been fought on her face, flicked her eyes across Johnny's shoes but gave no other sign she'd heard him. "Okay," Johnny said, clapping his hands again. "The music will start in just—" "When do the whores come out?" Bobby interrupted, drawing out the word whores so it sounded like hooers. Excuse me? "Them two dumb whores. The ones done fucked up my life. When do they come out on the stage?" Johnny felt his grin slip off his face. The other guests will come out on the second commercial break, Bobby." The fat man said and sniffed. "I ain't seen them whores yet. I'd like to have a look at what my wife left me from 2 babies for." The gap-toothed girl had been studying the surly security guard, but pasted her eyes to the floor as Bobby glared at her. His face red above the collar of his dress shirt the wardrobe people had provided for him. "I'd like to see if that whore was worth it," Bobby said and sniffed again. Right," Johnny said. The theme music for the show started up, and Johnny heard Dwayne's voice come across the speakers, announcing the show's topic and then running through the ads and sponsorships. "Okay, everyone," Johnny said, reloading his grin. "Get to the spots we showed you before." The odd little parade of people shuffled past him toward the designated stage entrance. Bobby was glaring at Honey while his face got a shade redder, and Daniel cast a hateful look at Johnny, his lips pursed so tight he could have juiced an orange on them. Susan said nothing, but kept her eyes on the floor and appeared as though she was struggling not to cry. "That's an angry group of people right there," Johnny said to the security guard. Steve, he thought his name was, as he followed. "It's the human condition, boss," Steve said. "When people get hurt bad enough, they get angry about it." He tilted his chin, which could do a reasonable impression of a bumper of a truck, towards the plotting group. "And those folks been hurt plenty." Johnny found he could not look at the towering security guard in the face. He turned and walked towards his own entrance. A stagehand passed him a microphone and a small collection of cue cards just as Dwayne finished the obligatory introductions. "And now, the host of our show," Johnny said and dropped his voice an octave into a throaty purr. "Johnny Racket." Trotting the last few steps to the entrance, Johnny jumped onto the stage with his arms wide, microphone and cue cards held up in the air. He bowed to the audience, then ran up to the third row of seats, gave a loud kiss on the cheek to a middle-aged woman the ushers had conveniently placed there, like they always did. As she screamed in delight and fanned herself, Johnny tipped a rakish wink at the nearest camera, then jumped back onto the stage. "Today, folks, we have a very special show for you." It was always a special show, Johnny thought. The kind of special that should be riding the short bus to school and wearing a hockey helmet. "Today, our guests have come to settle their scores and confront the—" He paused dramatically, waiting for the audience to pull in their breath and lean into him. He hated the glorified vultures who filled his seats, come to feed on the reeking carcass of someone else's bad luck. But he could play them like a finely tuned instrument. "The lesbian strippers who stole their baby mamas." The crowd erupted in jeers and shouts, clapping their hands and hooting out their approval. One particularly fat man in a black baseball cap with a broad white number 3 on it brayed out laughter so loud Johnny felt slightly embarrassed. "Lesbian strippers," the fat man shouted, slapping the belly that poked out beneath his t-shirt. "I fucking love dykes. I bet they're ugly as fuck." The fat man's braying laughter was commonplace, at home and welcome among the members of Johnny's audience, but for some reason it set the hairs on the back of Johnny's neck to dancing. He struggled to keep his grin in place as he glanced up at the stage lights, wondering if it was just his imagination, or had they gotten a little dimmer. "Our first guest says that everything in his household was fine until his wife went to a friend's stag-at party and met up with a lesbian stripper." Johnny made a dramatic flourish towards the stage. "Everyone, please welcome Bobby." The crowd jeered and laughed and hissed as Bobby appeared, shuffled to a halt and glaring out at the crowd through narrow, churlish eyes. Someone booed, and the crowd howled all the harder. When Bobby didn't move from his spot, just inside the entrance, someone threw a coupled-up red and white popcorn bag, which Johnny found odd since they didn't sell popcorn in the theater. "Please, Bobby, take a seat," Johnny said, making another flourish towards the row of chairs on the stage. The pudgy man looked at the chairs, looked at Johnny, and then slowly plodded over and sat down. "So, Bobby," Johnny said, putting on the practiced tone of false concern the network executives and the braying audience both loved. "Tell us what brings you here today." Bobby sniffed. "My wife done off with some whore from the titty bar." Where most of Johnny's guests were filled with self-righteous, sanctimonious, and often fabricated fury, Bobby spoke with a flat tone and an odd detachment. It seemed to deflate the crowd. They came to see blood, both figurative and literal, and this man barely seemed to want to fight. "And, how does that make you feel?" Johnny prompted, trying to get a response out of the bland little man. "It makes me feel shitty," Bobby said and sniffed again. "Shitty and embarrassed that my wife, the woman I stood up and took vows for, would walk out on me and then drag me up on this here stage to tell the whole world how she'd done it." He leaned one elbow on the arm of the chair and let his narrow eyes drift around the studio. "Only reason I'm even doing this because I got left with the 2 kids and can't hardly afford to pay for the house no more, and I need the money you people promised me." Johnny looked over at Dwayne, whose face twisted as though he just stubbed his toe in something. The fact the show paid the guests was supposed to be kept quiet. The audience wanted to see angry lunatics flailing at each other on the stage, not people who were getting paid for the show. The audience had gone still. Even the fat man in the number 3 hat stopped slapping his belly. A few people were looking around, and there was some muttering behind Johnny as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He had felt crowds like this before, in his early days of stand-up, when the jokes fell flat and the audience started to grumble. When they actually started talking amongst themselves, there was no saving the set. "Let's bring out Bobby's wife," Johnny said, making another flourish, hoping to catch the crowd's attention. "The woman who breaks hearts in 2 genders. On both sides of town. Honey!" It was a lame joke, but it got a couple of laughs from the fat man in the front row, and a half-hearted round of applause and jeering bloomed in the crowd. Johnny looked at the right side of the stage, waiting for Honey to walk out, but there was a fluttering in the curtain and several sharp yelps of protest from the backstage. Johnny heard Steve growl, his voice so deep it sounded like a tuba being played underwater. "Fine, take her," the big man said, and then Honey appeared, dragging Susan by the hand. Johnny said, looking over at Dwayne, who only shrugged in response. "Here's Honey, and another guest, Susan." "She don't look like much of a stripper," the fat man brayed. "You ain't had enough of them whores from town you gotta find one here?" Bobby asked, turning in his seat to face Honey. "What's the matter with you?" Honey stammered and cleared her throat, the sound amplified and distorted by the microphone pinned to her dress, making her voice sound like a growl. Above the stage, the lights flickered, and Johnny looked up. Sure, it wasn't his imagination. Honey continued to stammer, and Johnny glanced over at Dwayne and pointed surreptitiously up the lights. Again, Dwayne shrugged. "Honey," Johnny said, turning his attention back to the stage, where the gap-toothed woman still gripped Susan by the hand and cast nervous glances at both her husband and the audience. "Tell us what's been on your mind these past few weeks, and tell us how you and Susan came to be such close friends." He turned and tipped his wink at the audience again, trying to get them engaged with another lame joke, but the audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't jeering. They were just huddling in their seats, looking as uncomfortable and as miserable as the scene unfolding on the stage. "Yeah, honey," Bobby said and sniffed again. "Why don't you tell us what's been going on in that head of yours? Why you want to embarrass me in front of all those people I don't know? Tell us all how you left your children at home to go be with someone else." He tilted his chin at Susan, who was picking at the hem of her dress and looking up at the lights while she licked her lips repeatedly. "And what do you want with her?" "I was scared is all," Honey said. "I didn't want to have to walk out here alone." "You ain't never gonna be alone when you was with me," Bobby said. "I told you that more than once. I don't know why'd you throw that away for some titty dancer." Honey cleared her throat again and looked at Johnny. "Mr. Rackett, I think this was a mistake. I don't want to do this no more." Johnny opened his mouth to speak and then closed it again. For one of the very few times in his life, he had no idea what to say. The false wall of the set shook, and several shouts came from behind the curtain. Steve stumbled onto the stage, a wriggling Daniel in his grip. The small man's shirt was untucked and wrinkled, and his beard looked like an angry cat that had been rubbed backwards. Despite the fact Steve must have been nearly 200 pounds heavier, he was having a hard time holding on to the skinny man, and Daniel was clawing his way towards Susan and Honey. "Why?" Daniel shouted. "Why did you do this to me? I did everything for you. I loved you." Susan's eyes were wide, and tears welled at the bottoms as she looked anywhere but at Daniel, then stepped on the other side of Honey so the gap-toothed woman was between them. Normally, when Steve had to struggle with someone, the crowd hit its feet, cheering him on. Now they were all sinking down in their seats, apparently trying to escape the spectacle developing on the stage. Bobby was on his feet now, growling at Honey over the top of Susan's hanging head, accusing her of ruining his life, while Daniel still twisted in Steve's grip, howling like a cat that had been set on fire. He never had guests that he couldn't control, or an audience that he couldn't get to buy into the drama, but Johnny knew this show was lost. It was time to pull the plug. He took 2 steps towards Dwayne's little desk. "No strippers," he said, holding the microphone away from his body so his voice wouldn't come over the speakers. The cacophony on the stage had gotten louder, with Honey now shouting back at Bobby and Susan crying openly as both hands tugged at the hem of her dress, distorting the fabric. Dwayne tilted his head to one side, then shrugged again, holding up one hand to his ear, indicating he hadn't heard. "No strippers," Johnny said a little louder. "No strippers. Call security." "You want the strippers immediately?" Dwayne said, then shrugged and tapped a button on the surface of his desk. That button, Johnny knew, would turn on a light backstage, signaling the stage manager to send out the next guest. The moment that Dwayne tapped the button, one of the lights on the left side of the stage burned out with a loud pop, and the stage got a little darker. A moment after that, 2 women walked out on stage, their hands above their heads in dramatic gestures, as though they were expecting significant fanfare. They were both bleach blonde and dressed in schoolgirl outfits, complete with significantly tight white tops filled to bursting with fake bosom, and minuscule plaid skirts. On any normal day, they'd have made the crowd go nuts, especially the fat guy in the front row. Today, the audience only groaned. The moment they appeared, Bobby stopped yelling at his wife and turned to face them, squaring his pudgy bulk and puffing out his chest, his hands held out from his hips like an Old West gunfighter ready to draw. The ugly tension in the room got a little tighter, till Johnny could almost hear it whine, like a violin string that had been wound too tight. He looked around for more help and found none. Steve was still struggling with Daniel, whose frenzy had reached a new pitch since the alleged lesbian strippers had walked onto the stage, and the audience sat in mute fascination. Their rapt attention had lost the mean-spirited edge it usually carried, and they all had simply horrified looks on their faces as though they were about to watch an autopsy instead of an interview. Above Johnny's head, the lights flickered again, flashing on and off rapidly like a strobe light, giving the scene on stage a choppy, disjointed appearance. When the lights stilled, Bobby lifted one hand to point a finger at the 2 strippers. "You're them whores," he said, in a bland voice, nearly a shout. "You're them whores that stole my wife away." The 2 strippers burst into laughter. It was apparent, to Johnny anyway, they hadn't caught the sour drift in the room and thought the show was going to be full of laughter and drama. They were too stupid to smell the blood that was coming. "We didn't steal your fucking wife," one of the strippers said. "We're not even lesbians." "Nobody wants to steal that skinny bitch," the other said. "You'd have to pay someone to take her away." "She just kept coming to the bar and asking for lap dances," the first stripper said. "She's just so pathetic she imagined we were dating because I told her she was pretty while I was taking her money." She punctuated the word money by rubbing her thumb and fingers together. Then she laughed, and the other stripper joined in. It was cackling, mean laughter, and they both threw their hands in the air and faced the audience. Honey stared at the 2 women, stunned disbelief on her face. It was obvious that she was not in on their little joke. The look of anger on Bobby's face disappeared so fast it might have been slapped off. In its place bloomed a look of such awful, burning sadness that Johnny felt his own eyes grow hot. "You left me for someone didn't even want you?" Bobby said, his voice a strangled whisper, barely audible through the speakers above the stage. "You gave up our babies for some whore who don't even care about you?" Honey released Susan's wrist and used both hands to cover her face as she let out a wailing cry. Bobby turned again to the strippers, let out a scream, and lunged towards them. It was only then the 2 women realized that nothing on the stage was an act, and no one was having a good time anymore. They tried to turn on their high heels, their arms pinwheeling for balance, but Bobby was on top of them, bearing to the ground, his fists flailing erratically. As the pudgy man collided with the 2 women, Daniel caught Steve in the face with an elbow and wriggled free. He dove on top of the melee, his own narrow fist slamming into someone with a fleshy slap. In the audience, the middle-aged woman that Johnny had kissed let out a scream, and all the lights went out with a flashing pop and a shower of sparks. The windowless studio was plunged into total darkness, and several more of the audience members began to scream and cry. It took a handful of seconds for the emergency lights on the walls to come on, and when they did, it was with a sickly red-orange glow. The sparse light only gave a vague indication of the inside of the studio, and instead of lighting people's faces, it made their shadows more pronounced, so that the hollows of their eyes took on the appearance of leering skulls. The microphone in his hand still seemed to be working, and Johnny was about to call out to people, have them move towards the exit, ask Dwayne to go for security, when he felt a breeze on his face. It was a stiff breeze, as though he were standing out on the studio roof instead of inside the darkened interior. Searching for the source of the breeze, he looked up, and his microphone dropped from his fingers that no longer seemed inclined to respond to him. Among the bars that held the stage's lights was a thick, black mist, swirling briskly in the strange breeze. The mist was settling quickly towards the floor, and as it reached the upper floors of the audience seating, Johnny felt terribly cold. As the temperature dropped, several of the audience members looked up and promptly started screaming. Several tendrils of the black mist separated from the main body and reached down towards the combatants on stage. All of them were unaware of what was happening. The tendrils landed on Steve, the tallest person there, and he yelled out in pain and surprise as they wrapped around him. He stopped trying to separate Bobby from the stripper he was strangling and turned to flee, but the mist wrapped him tight and sucked him upward into the main body of the cloud. Steve's scream turned to a shriek and then ended abruptly as he disappeared into the darkness. All over the studio, the tendrils were reaching out to grip people. Johnny saw several tendrils coming towards him and turned and ran, diving for cover behind Dwayne's desk. "What the fuck is happening?" Dwayne asked as he crouched beside Johnny. Johnny fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out his flask, spinning the lid off to take a drink. "I don't know, man. That black shit. I think I saw it before, but I never paid any attention because I thought it was just drunk." "What do you think it is?" Dwayne asked. Johnny took another swig from the flask, found it empty, and tossed it away. "It's been getting worse the last few months, I think. Like all the hate and anger we've been pulling out of people on that stage for the last 3 years has been collecting in the rafters." "This is crazy," Dwayne said, licking his lips and peeking around the edge of the desk at several tendrils of the black mass that were lazily reaching for them. "There is one good thing," Johnny said. "What's that?" "We can't get in shit from the network because we'll probably be dead." Dwayne barked a laugh. It was brief and a little frantic, but as soon as it came out of his mouth, the tendril reaching for his head shrank backwards. Johnny noticed and propped himself up on his knees. "Have you noticed the studio is just like me now?" he asked Dwayne. "What? How?" "Half lit for most of the show." Dwayne laughed again, a little deeper this time, a little longer, and the tendril above them snapped backwards into the black mass. Johnny got his unsteady legs underneath him and tumbled over the desk. In front of him, trying to hide under a seat, was a fat man in the front row. Johnny kicked him in his broad ass. "So, I went home to my wife last night," Johnny said, and then the fat man looked up at him. "She had a pair of crotchless panties. When I walked in, she pointed between her legs and says, 'You want some of this?' And I said, 'Hell no, look what it did to your underwear.'" The fat man looked at him for several seconds, his mouth hanging open, then started to laugh. The joke wasn't that funny, but in contrast to the fear coursing through the studio, it seemed absolutely hilarious, and the fat man laughed long and loud. All around where he was standing, the black mist shrank away, pulling back into itself. Running to the stage, Johnny grabbed his dropped microphone. "You ever meet my wife?" he shouted into the mic, and several people turned to look at him. "She is so fat, when she jumps for joy, she gets stuck." Most people in the crowd just ignored him, but there were a few ripples of laughter, and everywhere the sound burbled up, the darkness retreated. "What's the difference between my girlfriend and a supermodel?" "About 4 drinks." More laughter sputtered from the crowd, and the darkness shrunk. The audience was beginning to get a hold of itself as people realized the laughter was pushing the mist back into the rafters. Those who were unaware of what Johnny was doing shook their friends and pointed towards him on the stage. A screwdriver walks into a bar, and the bartender says, "We have a drink named after you." The screwdriver looks up at him and says, "You have a drink named Dave?" The jokes were ridiculous, and would have gotten him booed off the stage at any stand-up club, but the audience grabbed onto them like drowning sailors clinging to a sinking ship. Johnny kept telling every stupid one-liner he could think of, feeling any longer jokes would give the mist a chance to reform, to come back at them. "I applied for a job at a hardware store. They asked me if I was good with my hands. I said, I masturbate a lot. Does that count?" The entire audience was with him now, laughing, gripping themselves and each other. The wind in the studio picked up and the black mist began to spiral towards the center of the roof. "The mayor of the town I grew up in once gave a talk on heroin. I couldn't understand a damn word he said." The laughter of the audience reached a howling crescendo, far louder than the sounds of the screaming and arguing on the stage had ever been in the last 3 years. The black mist whirled, a cyclone trapped in a small space, and with a whistling pop, flashed out of existence. Slowly, the audience began picking themselves up and looking around. On the stage, Bobby and Daniel were disentangling themselves from the orange-tan limbless strippers and slowly getting to their feet. Dwayne appeared from behind his desk and walked up to Johnny, putting his arm around his shoulders. Did that just happen?" Dwayne asked, as they looked around at the disheveled and terrified people. "I think it did," Johnny replied, still looking at the roof of the studio. So, what do we do now? Johnny shrugged and straightened his tie. You ever hear a joke about two men walking into a bar? The end. I hope you guys enjoyed that and my horrible butchering of a southern man's accent. If you enjoyed this story, please think about liking it and subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. And thanks for being here with me. I always appreciate it.